Hey guys, it's Greg Alexander again, and today I wanted to talk about tidal water bass fishing fall patterns. So let me first say this. Knowledge is the key to catching fish. Understanding is the key to catching fish. You have to understand what's going on in order to effectively present your selected lures to fish. And of course that changes throughout the year no matter what body of water you're on. But with tidal rivers, it's a little bit different in the fall than it is on lakes and reservoirs. Lakes and reservoirs kind of set up like this. Lakes and reservoirs set up, the temperature starts to drop at night, the days get shorter, the water temperature falls from the 90s or the 80s towards, the upper 70s. And that tends to trigger a movement of bait, not necessarily to the backs of the creeks at this point in time, but it tends to pull the bait up from deeper water because now the water maybe even turned over or it's cooling down enough that now these bait fish don't need that depth in order to maintain cooler, more oxygenated water. Now the cooler, more oxygenated water is, more, not even cooler, but the more preferable water temperature and oxygen levels are at the top. As it cools down, fish are cold-blooded and they want to move up in the water column and get that radiant heat from the sun. And so this gets them up on top. And this is why, so many times, September, early October, it seems like the bait of choice is going to be some type of topwater bait, a buzz bait, a walking bait, a plopper bait, a popper, a frog, whatever. Because the fish are looking up because the bait has gone from down here to up here, right? But in these rivers, it's a little bit different. We'll talk about it in just a second. But see, then what happens with the lakes is later in the fall, these fish gravitate towards these shallow pockets and things that heat up quickly with the sun each day. Still have a little bit of an algae bloom going where the main lake tends to clear up the algae bloom time. The algae kind of goes away, which these bait fish feed on, so they go to the backs of the pockets. So in a river, the water's constantly mixing. So there's no difference necessarily in like the amount of algae bloom necessarily in a creek versus in the main river in the fall. So the fish don't tend to go to the backs of the creeks in the fall in a tidal river. They actually tend to move away from the backs of creeks in the fall in a tidal river. Now, backwater areas that don't have a lot of current may act more like a lake where, the bait fish are coming to these backwater, low flow areas that have a little bit of depth and they'll move into these areas. But as far as like flowing creek type situations that were so good in the heat of summer, now these fish have left. And they leave these flowing creeks for a couple reasons. The water temperature drops in these creeks much quicker than it does on the main body of water. A lot of these creeks are shaded. A lot of these creeks are spring fed. A lot of these creeks, the water temperature is, 2 to 5 or 6 degrees colder than the main temperature. These smaller creeks tend to have more clear water in them, which doesn't hold the heat. And not just a temperature change, but that temperature change also moves the bait fish out of the creek because they're moving towards their comfort zone, right? And see, let's understand that all bass, preferable temperature according to science is about 80 degrees. So he's going to want to be, you know, if the water temperature drops to 60, but he's got 65 available to him that has the resources for him to eat, then he's going to be there. If he doesn't have the resources, he's going to go where the resources are. But the resources are going to follow the comfort also, not just the bass, see? The bait also follows the resources, the comfort, and the food. So these creeks clear up. They don't have much, you know, algae in the water for bait fish to eat on. The fish leave. They go out to the main river, which is more color to the water, more algae, more fertile that time of year. So that moves them out. So that's just the opposite of a lake. River bass come out of the creeks. I'm talking about creeks. I'm talking about flowing creeks. See, a creek on a lake is not necessarily a flowing creek. A lot of these creeks on the lakes are, you know, dead end, or if it rains, they get a little bit of flow into them. But if it doesn't rain, they don't have any flow into them at all. And, you know, they move in, these bait fish move into these creeks. But on a river, they move out of the creeks. So then as fall progresses on a tidal river, we move away from the topwater bite, because the topwater bite was all about the bait fish coming to the surface to get the heat, getting in shallow water with, you know, some type of fertility to the water. And as the water continues to cool, the river gets less and less fertile because the sun is not creating near as much photosynthesis in the algae, and then the whole system starts to slow down. See, but the bass still want to eat. Excuse me. So as fall progresses on a river, these fish go from topwater to bottom bouncing baits. And there's a period of time between the topwater and the bottom bouncing baits where you can catch them on most anything. Square bills, crankbaits, rattle traps, chatterbaits, pretty much anything you want to throw. And there's days even, you know, towards the later part of fall where you've had some stable weather for a while. Well, they'll still do that. They'll maybe pull up, you know, in shallow water because the water got warmed up a little bit or something. But as fall progresses, these fish are going from the creeks, the high flow current areas, to channel edges with some current, to winter no current areas with clearer water. So they're making this transition. So later in fall, as the water temperature on these rivers, you know, approaches the low 50s and even into the upper 40s, I like to say to about 48 degrees on its way down and holding at 48 and then going down, that's when you get into winter on rivers for the most part, with the exception of, you know, Southern California and some of the Gulf Coast states. Maybe they never see that temperature. So your temperature would have to be adjusted a little bit for what you consider winter in those areas. So as the water cools, the fish get on a more stable area. So what's a more stable area? A more stable area is going to be a little bit deeper water that has some cover, that's not in ripping, boiling current. You know, a deep backwater area, marinas, eddy areas, the same type of place that they're going to be in the winter, but maybe not quite as deep yet, or maybe not, you know, quite as clear water at this point in time. So then you got to transition into, you know, deeper diving crankbaits reeled slowly, slow rolled spinner baits, slow rolled rattling baits, whether it's a chatterbait or a rattle trap. Slow roll these things, because these fish are now off of the edge. And if you reel like you normally do, you know, when you were catching them in the summer or the early fall where the fish were relatively shallow, you're not going to catch them because it's going to be over their head too far. So you got to get down to them. And then it'll go from where they won't even touch that stuff in late fall to, if you're not throwing a jig or a shaky head or a Ned rig or something like that out off a drop off or a brake line or some type of deeper structure without a ton of current on it, then you're probably not going to get bit. The one bait that I think you can get bit on pretty good in late fall in a river under clear water situations with not a lot of current now would be a suspending jerkbait. So that's something that you always want to try in late fall. And then just before winter, obviously, these fish are going to be starting to move. Almost all of them are going to start to move out of any type of current flow, unless they have a place, on the main river that is eddied in both directions. They're probably going to move to a place that has an eddy in no direction or low current to winter in. So they start to make a migration, a lot of times off of the main river into these deeper backwater areas, into the marinas, into the heads of these bigger creeks that don't have a lot of flow at the end because maybe they're dammed off with a pond or a lake on the other side that just has a minimal amount of flow into them. And that's the places that these fish are heading towards. So, you got to kind of follow them. You got to kind of follow them. In the winter, we follow them out the opposite direction. They're heading towards shallower, more current, higher feeding areas in the spring just before they go to spawn, and then they'll move again. And in the fall, it's just the opposite. They're coming away from these higher feeding, higher current areas into lower current areas where even the bait fish are starting to congregate also, because these fish metabolism is getting slower and slower and slower, and they're not going to want to fight the current. So these are some things to think about with your fall tidal water bass fishing. If you have any questions about that, you can post them in the comments below. Again, thanks for watching, and have a blessed day.